Hey YouTube, Twig here, I'm bringing you all an update to my Worm Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck profile for September 2022. For those of you who don't know, I am a big fan of the Hidden Arsenal lore, and the Worms played a big part in the first couple stories that we had, being the invaders from another world to the dual terminal world. And with them, they had 26 different Worm monsters in their arsenal, but for this deck, we'll be focusing on the best ones to run for a version of the deck that focuses on getting out Worm Zero while still being a pretty big control deck, using the many different trap cards we have to flip up our Worm monsters, gaining their flip effects, or just having a pretty good reptile setup with some of the other more generic cards we run. So let's go ahead and get started with the deck profile. So to start off with the main deck monsters, I am running 3 Worm Zeks with this card. When it is normal summon, you can send 1 reptile type Worm monster from your deck to the graveyard. If you control a face-up Worm Yagin, this card cannot be destroyed by battle. So this card just works well for the setup that is meant to do with Worm Yagin. So along with Worm Zeks, we are also running 3 copies of Worm Yagin. If the only monster you control is a Worm Zeks, you can special summon this card from your graveyard in face-down defense position. If you do, banish it from play when it is removed from the field. And when this card is flipped face-up, select 1 face-up monster your opponent controls and return it to its owner's hand. So the setup you want to do initially is just to have your Worm Zeks set up your Yagin in the graveyard, and then you can special summon Yagin onto the field, and then depending on what trap setup you have, you can have the flip then to bounce a card your opponent has on the field, and then also use them to reset your monsters back on the field to do the play again, as long as you control the Worm Zeks monster when this card is flipped face up. By just being able to have that setup, you also have 2 monsters on the field that can be used for a rank 4 or link 2 play just by using those 2 all together. I also run 3 Worm Carteros with this card. You flip it and add 1 level 4 lower reptile Worm monster from your deck to your hand. This is the search that you can even just use to set up your Worm Zeks, being able to send that card. So with it, you can set up your Carteros, flip it up, add Zeks, summon Zeks, send Yagin, and then with Yagin you can either go for the special summon play via another method, or have the Carteros be destroyed when your opponent swings into it, still activating the flip effect to then add the Zeks to your hand, clearing the field so you can then have the same play that I mentioned before with both of these cards. I also run 2 Worm Links. During the end phase of this card's face up, you draw 1 card. It has to be a flip effect first, so you have to have this card set and then ready to go for the activation, but you can still, once again, use your trap so your opponent doesn't have to attack into it, flipping this card up, as long as you have some of the other destruction cards or disruption cards to use against your opponent. You can keep this Worm Links on the field and not have to fear about it being destroyed, but still being able to keep hand consistency. For some of the bigger boss monsters for the Worms, I also run 3 Worm King. This card can be tribute summoned in a face-up attack position by tributing 1 reptile Worm monster. You can tribute 1 reptile Worm monster to select 1 card your opponent controls and destroy it. This is not a once per turn either, so if you have a bunch of different Worm monsters on the field and Worm King, you can just repeatedly destroy cards on the field using it. That's why it is a definite boss monster in the deck, and one that you want to use for that destruction power to then clear your opponent's field and then just swing with all your many other monsters you have. And having 2700 attack alone, it can still hit for some big damage on its own if you had to use your other worms for the tribute destruction. I also run 1 Worm Queen for the rest of the Worm lineup. You can tribute 1, summon this card in face-up attack position by tributing 1 reptile Worm monster. And once per turn, you can tribute a reptile Worm monster to special summon 1 reptile Worm monster from your deck with a level less than or equal to the tributed monster. So you can then just get another special summon, depending on what worm you summoned out onto the field. Being able to go for the lower level with this card, most of the time I'll just go for the Worm Links. You can tribute Worm King to go for more of the other setup we have in the deck with some of our other Worm monsters, but most of the time that's my favorite one, because then you can just use the Worm Links and some of the other traps we run when I get to them to flip them back face down and set up the flip effect thanks to it. And then for the rest of the main deck monsters, I just run 3 Evil Dragon and Nanta. It cannot be normal summoned or set. It must be special summoned by banishing all reptile monsters you control or in your graveyard. It gains attack and defense equal to the combined number of monsters banished for the special summon times 600, and once per turn during the end phase, target 1 face card on the field and destroy it. More destruction play, but the big power is just being able to set up all the worms in your graveyard with the next card we'll talk about, and then being able to banish them to summon out this boss monster before you even get out your fusion monster. Moving on now to the spells. The spell in hand that I am talking about is Future Fusion. During your first standby phase after this card's activation, show one fusion monster in your extra deck. Send fusion materials listed on it from your main deck to the graveyard. And during the standby phase after this card, second activation, you can fusion summon one extra deck monster with the same name as the monster shown and target it with this card. And when this card leaves the field, destroy that target. And when this targeted card is destroyed, destroy this card. So it's a weaker version than the original Future Fusion, obviously, but the main go-to is that your opponent lets the set off go, because if it is set up and you're able to use the send effect, that in itself can be much more important than the actual fusion play, which I'll go over in a combo at the end of the video. I also run 2 Worm Call once per turn. If your opponent controls a monster, you control no monsters, you can special summon 1 reptile worm monster from your hand in face down defense position. So before you even normal summon, you can at least special summon a worm monster on the field face down, whether it be Worm Yugioh or Worm Links, and then have just that normal to go through from your hand as well. Having this as a continuous spell always gives you this resource. I'm just running 2 though, because you really only need the 1 on the field to use it, and then afterwards it really doesn't do much else for you. For the rest of the spells, I run 1 Harpy Feather Duster for back row destruction for some of the big plays you can hit for the numbers with Evil Dragon Ananta, 1 Call by the Grave, along with 1 Burial from a different dimension to get back some of the banished cards from Ananta, and also 1 Monster Reborn for special summoning cards back onto the field, and 1 Fusion Substitute. You don't necessarily have to use Future Fusion for the Worm Zero, so having 1 Fusion Substitute just as an added option definitely will pop up with some of the many different worms you can just swarm the field with. And that is it for the spells. Moving on now to the traps. I run 3 W Nebula Meteorite. Change all face down monsters on the field to face up defense position. During the end phase of the turn, change all face up light reptile monsters you control to face down defense position, then draw 1 card for each. And after that, you can special summon 1 level 7 or higher light reptile monster from your deck. This is meant specifically for this deck. It works with all the playstyles you were meant to do. It changes all face down monsters on the field face up. It lets you special summon a level 7 or lower light monster, which is your go-to for the higher, giving you either Worm King or Worm Queen on the field. So with it, you have all criteria met thanks to this card. And I like to believe that the W Nebula Meteorite is the meteor that the worms crash down on to Earth with it, and all the many different invading worm forces entered the dual terminal world because of this card. I also run 3 Junk Sleep. This card came out since the last deck profile I did for this deck. So if your opponent normal or special summons a monster, you can change all face down defense position monsters you control to face up attack position. And during the end phase, you can change all monsters you control to face down defense position. You can only use each effect of Junk Sleep once per turn, but just another easy way to flip up Yugioh and then bounce a card your opponent controls back to their hand. You can really mess up that resource just being able to, when they normal summon that monster, or special summon it, and then just having that monster back in their hand where they can't really do much with it. And then I also run 3 offerings to the Snake Deity, more destruction power, plus another way to at least protect your draw power cards you want on the field, like Worm Links, from being destroyed by destroying another reptile monster, and then 2 other cards your opponent controls. And I also run 3 Infinite Impermanents to finish off the main deck. I didn't run Ash Blossom in the deck since I wanted to focus on the reptile lineup as a whole, so no other monsters in the main deck, but still a pretty heavy trap lineup means that this card just fits in perfectly well with them to use for the deck. And that is it for the main deck. We'll now move on to the extra deck. For our main go-to boss monster, we are running 3 Worm Zero. You need 2 or more reptile worm monsters. For each fusion material monster with a different name used to fusion summon this card, you gain 500 attack, also gain these effects, and once per turn, you can select 1 reptile monster in your graveyard and special summon it in face down defense position if you had 2 or more. If it's 4 or more, you can banish 1 reptile monster from your graveyard to send 1 monster on the field of the graveyard, and if it's 6 or more, once per turn, you can draw 1 card. So you have the 6 or more option, since we have the Worm King, the Worm Links, Worm Carteros, the Worm Zex Yugioh, and then also the Worm Queen, meeting the criteria for all of the monsters needed for the future fusion play to gain all of the card effects, and then also having this card be 3,000 attack in total because of it, and then also just the additional special summon power also. So that's why I like to run the lineup I use, because there are exactly 6 to run, and then also the different fusion plays that you can make with this card. And the future fusion setup means you can potentially send all the worm monsters monsters to the graveyard. I normally like to do this when I have cards like Evil Dragon and Nanta in my hand to just have this big boss monster banish everything to gain a pretty high attack power as well. For the rest of the extra deck, I run 2 King of the Pharaoh Imps, just needing 2 level 4 monsters. It's a reptile itself, but once per turn you can detach 1 to add 1 reptile monster from your deck to your hand. Just another easy way to search any of the worm monsters or even Evil Dragon and Nanta to your hand using our cards. Also 1 number 41 Baguska, 1 Abyss Dweller, and the 1 Daigusto Morale. I definitely do like this card in the deck just for its recycle power for your graveyard. And then for the Link monsters, I run 1 Cross Sheep, 1 Barricade Board Blocker, 1 Underclock Taker, 1 Hippo Shenangan, 1 Alien Shock Trooper. I don't normally use it for its own effect since they use 8 counters, but still a great Link monster to use for the reptile purpose. And then also 1 Nightmare Phoenix and 1 Nightmare Unicorn to finish off the extra deck. As for some of the go-to plays, like I said, Future Fusion is a big one if you activate this card. And then the following standby phase, you can send all the different worm monsters needed for the play setup. With that being used, you then have your 6 on the field to use to then summon out your Worm 0. But the big play will also come for the fact that you can send all your worms to the graveyard to then banish to hit a very powerful Evil Dragon and Nanta on the field to swing into your opponent with. That's why I like to run Harpy's Feather Duster to clear the back row as well. So you have the swing of that attack go uninterrupted against your opponent or your opponent's monster. But that is it for the deck profile. I hope you all enjoy. It's a really awesome deck to consider, especially being a pretty powerful one that uses some of the generic reptile support all together. And definitely do look into building it. It's pretty affordable as well with having not too many pricey cards and a lot of usable reptile stuff from the Ancient Guardians booster pack. And as always, until next time, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And Kira, Twig, out.